Let's go through some sports photography editing in Lightroom. So we'll be looking at photos today from the Radicals Union game I just shot the other week. And my typical workflow is I'll just bring all the photos into Lightroom and I'll just go through them photo by photo, just clicking through. And then anything I like, I'm just gonna give it a star, or I like to use 5 stars just by hitting the 5 on my Mac keyboard. Anything I don't like, I just leave blank. So the first thing I do to edit any photo is deal with the cropping. And particularly the straightening in this photo is standing out to me. You'll see like this horizon line going straight across the photo isn't totally straight. So if you hit C to bring up your crop in Lightroom, you'll see this line doesn't line up with where the fence and the ground are meeting. So I'm just gonna drag this straightening dial until that looks good to me. Hit enter. So I'm also gonna crop this one so the player is more in the center. I just wanna keep like an equal weight to the photo. So right now I'm seeing like the space between his hand and this vertical line. I wanna make that about even with his foot in this vertical line. So I'm just gonna crop in from the side a little bit more, and something like that looks good to me. Now let's go through the basic lighting settings. So I'm always gonna mess with the exposure first. Can probably brighten it up just to the point where you're not blowing out everything too much. And we'll add some contrast. This is kind of the typical flow I'll do where I like brighten it slightly if it needs it, up the contrast, I lower the highlights generally, up the shadows. Although in this case, like I don't like the shadows that I'm getting inside the building. Up here, we're getting some like bikes and exercise equipment. But we can deal with that in a sec. Let's also up the whites and lower the blacks. So we've got this like kind of subtly contrasted look. You can just see a quick before and after. And then I'll go down to this white balance. I typically leave it as shot, but sometimes I'll mess around and just see what it looks like on auto or daylight, some of the other settings. To me, as shot looks good in this example, so we're gonna leave it like so. The colors I like fine in this photo. I try not to like over edit sports photography in this initial go. I feel like if I'm gonna bring it into a graphic later, I might perform further edits, or someone else, graphic designer, might be editing the photo more. So I try to leave it a little bit less edited, if that makes sense, just to give people more freedom to work with it later. But maybe this green on the grass is looking a little vibrant to me, so we might reduce the saturation there. Kind of makes the player pop out a bit more. And texture and clarity, I'll always up these just a little bit, somewhere in like the 10 to 20 range generally. Dehaze I typically don't touch, and then I do usually use some vignetting, especially when there's just like a central subject, like in this photo. So you can see this was the photo we started with, and after our edits, a lot more clarity and emphasis towards the middle of the photo where we have our main player. And let's go ahead and take out some of this detail up at the top. So I'm gonna go to our gradient masking tools. If you go to linear gradient and click and drag down while holding shift, now we can perform edits just to this top area of the image. And I'm just gonna like reduce the exposure, and we can probably even lower the shadows, maybe lower the highlights too. Yeah, we'll keep the highlights about there. But just because we don't care about what's going on up there, so I just want to keep the emphasis on the middle of the frame. I mean, honestly, we could crop the whole thing inward a little bit more. I want to keep the edges clean, so if I crop, I either want to crop out this player on the far right, or maybe just have him barely included. Like that looks okay to me, although I don't like this sliver of color in the fence. So I'm gonna get a little nitpicky and drag it back out. And that to me looks like a pretty clean edit. There's no real distracting elements around the edges. Obviously the top is a little bit darker, but that's okay. It brings our eyes to the middle of the frame, which is where we want the viewer to look. So now my typical workflow is to copy my initial edit settings, and because we're shooting everything in about the same lighting. I mean, obviously the sun was setting as I shot this game, so we will have to adjust slightly at times, but generally we can use similar edits for the bulk of our photos. So if you go to these 3 dots and copy edit settings, now I can go to my next photo, and let's just see what happens if we paste edit settings on this one. Like, that's already a great start in my mind. So we can see what happens if we bring the highlights down a little bit more and get some more detail in the sky potentially, although in this case there's not a whole lot there. Let's go to our crop with this one, and again I'm just gonna straighten out our grass here. So I'm looking at the ground and I want like this to be at the same level as this part on the left. And then I also want to make sure all these players are totally centered in the design. So going back to our crop, we can drag in a bit from this side, something like that. And now we have our team fully centered in the frame. We can even increase that effect just by reducing more of the vignette, darkening the edges of the photo. This is feeling a little dark overall. It's not quite as bright as the one we did before. So let's up the exposure just until it feels better. We can even up the shadows a bit more too. That looks good. Again, I'm just checking like the edges to make sure everything's clean and nothing is weirdly cut off, but this feels like a pretty well composed photo. Again, central subject. It's going to be a pretty common theme with the way I tend to shoot photos. Moving on to our next one. Again, C for a crop tool. Let's straighten this out. And I like that. I'm going to crop this in a good amount. Like, I don't think we need the players in that area, but I do like the players over here because this guy is clearly running out for some kind of route. And maybe something like that. Is it weird if we just have an arm there? It's not too weird. I don't want to crop in too much because then we lose some more of these players. And I still want this guy centered ideally too. So maybe we even adjust it like so. And now I feel like we could come out a little bit more, because at this point we've got enough of this player where it felt weird to just slightly have him in it. So I'm giving the viewer more of him, but still keeping the focus on our subject centered in the frame. So again, let's paste those same edit settings just as a starting point. And this is feeling like a little bit too texture clarity for me. So I'm right away just gonna lower those a little bit. And then maybe the highlights need to come down too. And we can up the shadows potentially. I know there's something that feels a little bit too contrasty, so I'm just trying to fix that. Maybe it's the whites and blacks. Yeah, so this is feeling a little bit better to me. I think also the red in the background is distracting me from our main subject, so we can go in to our color mixer, click on the reds, and just desaturate them a little bit, and potentially do something with the blues. Yeah, maybe we desaturate the blues a little bit too. Make them a little brighter. Ideally, we have a little bit more separation between the subject and the background, but that's just kind of a limitation of the lens I was using. So we're gonna work with what we have. And I think decreasing the vignetting helps this a little bit more. Keeps our focus where it should be on the disc. So again, a central subject. Let's fix our straightening right away. I'm just looking at the green of the grass where that meets the dark under the bleachers. And I don't mind the way it's cropped currently. We could crop in a little bit, both top and bottom. And I'm just holding Option, and you can click and drag from the middle dial of the crop window. But I don't want to cut off our guy on the right here too much. But that's a good start. We'll paste in our edit settings once again. This one, I think maybe we can brighten it a little bit more, potentially up the shadows. I feel like this is too much blue in this one, so I'm gonna, again, decrease saturation a bit. Sometimes I find myself making the same edits to some of these photos, so I'll recopy the edit settings from here and then repaste it to the next photos. You can also make presets if you want. If you go up to the top right in Lightroom, this menu right here, yours, you can add a preset basically once certain edits are applied, and then you can apply that to future photos. I tend to use that more if I have like two very different environments that I'm shooting in. Like if this game got super dark all of a sudden, I would probably have a different preset for the darker photos when like the lights came on versus the photos that were shot in the daylight. This game was pretty much the same lighting most of the time, so I feel like I'll just make subtle edits within our basic preset that we've been going with. Let's up the luminance a bit of the blues, just to brighten them a little more. And then again, I'm just gonna reduce the reds. If the players were wearing red, I'd feel better about having red as like such an aggressive color, but because it's in the crowd, it doesn't feel like it's gonna be as important. It's never really gonna be the focus of these photos. So let's take these new settings, copy edit settings. This one's interesting. So pretty slanted horizon line is the first thing I notice. So let's hit our crop. And this could be tough because we don't want to crop out the disk at the top, but we do want a straight line ideally. So in this case, unfortunately, we have to choose one or the other. I would always choose rather to have the disk in the frame than crop it out completely. So we're just gonna do the best we can there. And we'll paste in our new edit settings. This one feels pretty good. There's like a pretty clear spotlight in the middle. We could up the shadows here a little bit more just to bring some more detail into the darker areas. And one thing, if you zoom way in, clearly my ISO was a little bit on the higher side because you're seeing this digital noise, this grain. We can get rid of that in Lightroom just by scrolling down to the noise reduction panel on the right. You can do manual noise reduction. You can denoise using AI, which I haven't messed around with. I typically will just do this manual noise reduction and increase the luminance here. And you'll see, I mean, if you take this to the extreme, obviously this is not what we want, but we'll bring it to something like 25, might be pretty conservative. So a subtle difference. If you ever don't know what a dial is doing in Lightroom, just max it out either direction. You do this with exposure. Clearly there is a difference and you'll immediately know what that dial is used for. Here's a cool one. Let's again paste in our edit settings and I'm gonna straighten this horizon. And for this one, I still really want these players centered in the frame. So let's crop this kind of way in. So maybe something like that. We can go a little bit lower with the whole frame as well. And I think we can add a little bit more exposure. And because I cropped a good bit in, you're gonna notice more of this noise, more of the grain. So let's make sure we go down and denoise it a little bit, smooth it out so it's not as harsh. And I'm just curious what will happen if we up some texture and clarity. If you want to take the time, you could also make the texture and clarity just apply to our main subjects. Like if you wanted to bring up one of our gradients, you can do a radial gradient, for example. And if you just click and drag, it's going to make this oval. And now we can position this on our player. And from here, up the texture and clarity just on our guy in blue here, and even increase the exposure, brighten him up. This is another way you can kind of separate your subjects from the rest of the photo, from the background. And then we can also draw another one, add a radial gradient on this player as well. And we can rotate it so it fits him a little bit better. And it's kind of doing the same effect because it's within this same mask. So before any edits, after, this is what we got. Last photo we'll look at, I got this cool sunset glare photo, which to me just feels naturally a lot more artsy than the other one. So let's have fun with this edit. First, still gonna straighten as I always do. I'm just looking at where the signage hits the ground. So something like that. And then we probably don't need this guy's arm in the photo, so I'm gonna crop it that way, actually. And so for this one, I'm not gonna apply the same copied edit settings that we've been running with because this one feels very different. So let's just start from scratch. Exposure, probably don't need to change too much. Maybe brighten it up a little bit. Contrast, I feel like can be cool to get some more color in the sun. Ooh, and if you lower the highlights, you can all of a sudden see the detail on this building. I don't know if we want that or not. You probably don't want to blow out the highlights more, but yeah, maybe something like there. Shadows, it is nuts the amount of detail that cameras can capture. This was all captured in RAW, which means it's the most detail possible, the most pixels possible, and there's not any processing that happens in the camera other than just the digitization of the photo. So when you blow up the shadows, like it's such a dark photo to begin with, but there's also like so much that you can salvage of the original image. So I don't like it with the shadows blown out in this specific example. So I'm going to keep the shadows somewhat low, but it's still just so cool how much you can save even if the photo looks really dark when you first take it. For the temperature of this one, I feel like we can afford to make it a little bit warmer. Just kind of up the yellow. That feels maybe better. And then again, some texture clarity. Well, that's kind of cool. You get a little bit more of the white detail on the background. Speaking of, I'm gonna increase these whites a little bit more too. And we can always have some vignetting on the edges. So this one, before and after, kind of a cool, moody sunset vibe. I'll end this video by saying there's really no wrong way to edit. In the end, it's just whatever feels right to you. If you're trying to make it feel exactly how it looked in the moment, that's one thing, but sometimes you're trying to put your own artistic spin on it. Hope this helps, and have fun in Lightroom.